Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. I'm going to talk today about a subject that is not kind of the normal narrative you get on a channel like this, because it's very normal on a channel like this to bash the US. It's kind of, I don't know, it's popular to bash whoever the big guy is, right? And certainly there's lots to be said for the criticism side. We cover that lots, and you can go to lots of channels and cover it. But today I'm going to talk about reasons to be bullish on the US. And I think this is interesting to look at in light of the last 2 years or so. Now, when I say this, I'll caveat it by pointing out that saying that there are reasons to be bullish doesn't mean there aren't reasons to be bearish. There are definitely reasons to be bearish. We've talked a lot about things like possible loss of the global reserve currency status and negative consequences in that regard, potential lack of competitiveness, et cetera, right? There's lots of reasons to get down there. But today I'm going to talk about the other side of it, which I think is really worth understanding. And we're going to view this from a historical context, which is a perspective I did some research a number of years ago in light of some comments from Warren Buffett to try and kind of get some sense. And I'll put out a theory for you that I have for why the US has performed well in the past. And maybe this theory is accurate, maybe it's not. It's a theory, so we'll talk about it. Before we get into that, though, if you don't mind, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell. Appreciate your support. If you'd like more of these videos, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends. If you would like help with relocating abroad, figuring out where to go, getting citizenships, forming companies, opening bank accounts, paying the lowest legal amount of tax possible, please reach out to us. You can book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosemer. There's a link in the description below, or send us through our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. Okay, so Warren Buffett made a comment a few years back, I remember, saying something to the effect of, it's been a mistake to bet against the US for the last, whatever it was, 270 years, and it's a mistake to bet against the US today. And this got me thinking, is he just biased? I mean, he's gotten very rich off of being in America. He's American. He's clearly got some patriotism to America. I mean, his father was in the American government. He's potentially got some hindsight bias. He's got inductive reasoning. Like, is it true? Because the impression that I would have is, great nations rise and great nations fall. And the US could be a lot like the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire, eventually hit a point and started to crumble. And more crumbles from within than from without. So to test this, I decided to go and look and see if I could do some research on whether the US is continuing to be globally competitive relative to their peers. And I got the main thing that I decided to look at, because it's difficult to figure out, okay, how do you measure this, right? So the big thing that I looked at was GDP growth over time. And you can get kind of charts that will show you what's gone on with GDP growth over the last 20 years, over the last 30 years. And there's some really cool YouTube videos you can get where they'll show changing GDP over time across like hundreds of years. And it's kind of adjusting rankings in real time, and it'll flash, I don't know, year by year, whatever, how the numbers are changing. So very, very cool tool that you can look at. And you're going to find something very interesting when you look at the US. First of all, in the last 20 years and in the last 30 years, the US has performed one of the best in the world. Now, obviously, China has obliterated them. They obliterated everybody, right? So China off. Granted, China's growth rate is declining, even by their own numbers, if you believe their own numbers. In addition to this, Singapore beat them, Ireland beat them, there's a couple other places that beat them. But the US beat most Western countries, such as Canada, for instance, where I'm from, right? So that's kind of interesting. And then you can go and you can look at the longer time frame, going through 100 plus years, 200 years, whatever, somewhere around that. And you're going to notice a really interesting trend with the US, which is throughout various chunks of time, certain countries have accelerated really rapidly. We've seen this obviously with China recently. Before that, we saw Japan, we saw Germany, a few others obviously have gone through these periods of intense growth. And during those times, they radically outperformed the US in terms of just how rapidly they're growing. And there was probably fears in the late 80s that Japan would surpass the US because of this rate of growth, because of this tremendous industrialization, technical advancement, et cetera, et cetera. And that all kind of came to a grinding halt in 1990, and you saw this collapse of GDP, and they've never really fully recovered from that time. You see something to some extent similar with Germany. We'll see what happens to China. That remains to be seen. But the US doesn't seem to perform this way. The US is a lot more like Warren Buffett in terms of his compounding style than like some crazy venture capitalist. Meaning that if you look at Warren Buffett's returns each year over the entire 50 or so years that he's been investing, so whatever it is, it's a pretty long time, what you're going to find is that he never had the highest returns in any year. Right? His returns are not that extraordinary on an any year basis. What it is it's very consistent over time. So for basically 30 years, he did 10x his portfolio every 10 years for 30 years straight, 1,000x in 30 years. Very good returns, right? Works out to about 29% a year, and even over about a 50-year period, you're talking about 20% a year. So that just adds up. And the US is quite similar. The US seems to just chug along at, it varies obviously throughout history, but let's call it 2.5% a year GDP growth. And even if you look at cases such as post-2008, when you had this massive financial collapse, et cetera, and you would expect, oh, GDP is going to get cut back, it barely went back for 1 year and then just kept chugging along. Very, very interesting. I mean, you can go and you can look at the GDP growth charts for something like Italy, and you're going to see, there was a little period where they went way up, but then they just have kind of trickled down. There's a bunch of countries like this around Europe. The US is not this way. The US is pretty steady growth. And this begs the question, what is it about the US system that seems to work to maintain this steady growth? I mean, it is undeniable that there are lots of problems, right? And it's easy to look today and say, oh, hey, things are so bad. Well, let's go look over the last century, right? I mean, we had 2 world wars, we had the Great Depression, you had the Civil Rights Movement, you had the Vietnam War, you had very high inflation with, what went on with OPEC and the oil cartels in the 70s, et cetera, right? So there was a whole bunch of stuff that happened, and yet they managed to be quite consistent throughout this. These things didn't seem to derail the system. Why is that? What is it about their system? And you might say, well, this is just inevitable, but it's not inevitable because the US is pretty unique in this regard. Most countries have not had this sort of resiliency, this sort of consistency. Like we said, Japan hasn't done it, Germany hasn't done it, et cetera, et cetera. My theory is that it comes down to this. Diversity, the plurality of systems in the US. And I think we've seen this as a huge advantage. The US compared to many other parts of the world during the 2020-2021 period with the state system. You had some states that were locked down and, depending on your perspective, quite terrible, right? On the other hand, you had some of the most open places in the world were places like Florida and Texas, right? So people had the option to go where they wanted. They had got to choose something different. This was not true if you were to go to Germany, to Austria, to Australia, to Canada, etc. Canada, with their provinces system, isn't nearly as independently strong as the US state system is. In spite of all the talk of, say, the cantons in Switzerland, you find that the cantons prove not to be so different in this regard, et cetera, right? So there's this, within the division of power makes it's almost not like one country, it's like a collection of countries under one common banner, which is really interesting how that plays out in terms of the adaptability. And I think about this a lot from the standpoint of an organism, okay? So if you have an organism that is unable to mutate, okay, meaning that there's no cell mutation, then provided that a specific cell pattern or a particular set of adaptations are good for a given environment, it will excel, it's great. The problem is when the environment changes, that species will die off or will suffer greatly. It's the ones who have this plurality of different mutations that have the optionality to go in one way or another. And we see this, for example, if you look at what we've discovered from something called Gaia theory, if you're familiar with it. Gaia theory was developed, I believe, in the 70s, and it was looking at the Earth. There's nothing spiritual or esoteric about it or anything, but it's the concept that the Earth as a whole seems to function as a superorganism. What does this mean? A superorganism is when the behavior of the whole cannot be described by the behavior of the parts, and collectively it seems to maintain some sort of stasis, right? So it seems to adjust things in order to maintain a degree of stasis. And we can observe this if you look at the amount of solar radiation coming from the sun over a long period of time. This has changed quite dramatically, but the temperature of the Earth has remained relatively constant. And so you can ask, well, why is this? And what you see when you look at the ecosystem is that, say, for example, the temperature increases and this has certain consequences, and because of that, some form of bacteria will expand, and this form of bacteria then produces some sort of output that provides some sort of protection or reduces the amount of given particle in the atmosphere, et cetera, in order to kind of maintain this stasis, which is really an interesting phenomenon. And they use Gaia theory as one of the methods for looking for life on other planets, because the theory goes, if we were to look at life on other planets, we don't know what it would look like. It wouldn't necessarily look like any life on Earth, and therefore, how do you look for something when you don't know what it looks like? Well, if the overall system seems to maintain this stasis somehow, this would be a sign that there must be life there in order to maintain this balance. Now, one of the discoveries from Gaia theory was that biodiversity is not a sign of a healthy planet, but biodiversity is a sign of a potentially healthy planet. What do we mean by this? What we mean is, if you have a lot of biodiversity, in any given particular scenario, that makes no difference. But more biodiversity allows the Earth to adapt and change in different ways and deal with those changes, right? Similar like what I'm mentioning with respect to cell mutations, right? So I think you have something similar going on in the US. This is my theory. This could be inaccurate, but it's how I understand it, or kind of how I've tried to make sense of it. The US is one of the most diverse countries in the world. It's hard to appreciate if you come from, I don't know, Japan, which is extremely homogeneous, or from an Eastern European country, even if it's a large one like Russia, or if you come from, Australia, etc. Just how diverse the US is, culturally, in terms of various different systems, etc. Usually, the similarities within a country are much stronger. Here you have a lot of races, a lot of religions, a lot of different ways of doing things, tons of different industries, etc. And what does this mean? Well, if you go back to kind of the post-war area, what did we see? We saw big industrial industry. You have kind of the automotive industry around Detroit, right? Propping up, being very significant globally. You have the three big GM, Ford, Chrysler. Okay, that was wonderful. That helped to be a fuel to drive the country. Well, that over the last few decades has collapsed. Like, the American automotive industry is kind of a joke, aside from Tesla. It's recent, right? But what happened? Well, you had a shift to Hollywood. I guess Hollywood was kind of emerging in the middle period there, and Silicon Valley, right? As well as New York with finance. I mean, the export of toxic debt around the world that brought kind of the 2008 financial collapse was, principally US based. And so you had examples of where these industries, because you have so much plurality, so much diversity, it doesn't mean that any one area is going to do well. In fact, in general, collectively, it will probably underperform relative to a very homogeneous system that is highly adapted for the current environment. And we saw this with Japan, right? Japan radically outperformed the US. But the Japanese system, being so homogeneous, is not well adapted to deal with changing environments. And so as things changed, the system kind of stagnated. Whereas as things changed in the US, because there were so many different ideas, so many different ways of doing things, one pops up to replace it. And we even can see this if you see the migration of people from California to places like Texas, Florida, etc. Are Texas and Florida necessarily going to be better long term? Perhaps not. But what they do offer is they offer something that is better for a lot of people now. And that allows a certain growth in those areas, which then is going to have a pretty big long-term ability to sustain. So long as you can have something that's growing and working, that will eat up other portions and compensate. And so I think this is why you see a balance in the US not growing as fast in any given year as some other places, but being much more consistent and therefore having more overall growth. So anyway, this is the thing that I wanted to bring up as a reason to be bullish on the US, is the US simply has more diversity. Simply is a country that has better ability due to the independence of states to offer up a different climate for people who like things in different ways. Now, there's attempts of the federal government to erode that. There's, maybe some sort of overlaps and kind of increasing polarization in the country probably means that you have people driving into somewhat less diversity, which is probably not that good. You get sort of more people into narrowed camps. But that being said, you have a lot of differences still there. And so this is my theory. I would love to hear your theory. How do you explain what has happened over the last couple hundred years with the US versus other places? How does that affect how things are going to be going forward? And maybe more importantly, how does this position the US relative to other countries? Now, to be fair, like I said, I just did a video a few days ago on why I'm not moving to the US, why I think there's, things are changing for the US in a global context. But this certainly makes me more bullish on the US than on some other countries, for example, some of the countries in Europe. So let me know what you think, and I will see you on the next video.